If you're a fan of action-adventure, collectathon, or even Souls-like games, you're missing out if you're still sleeping on Kena Bridge of Spirits in 2023. Originally released in 2021 and finally finding its way onto Steam several months ago, this incredibly unique title takes place in an artfully crafted world where you'll restore life to the land, explore themes of trauma and forgiveness, and collect a bunch of cute little spirits. On top of all that, the game is plenty challenging for those of you that like to die repeatedly and learn from your mistakes. My name's Johnny Bueno, and let's take a look at Kena Bridge of Spirits. Kena Bridge of Spirits will unsurprisingly put you in the shoes of Kena, a young spirit guide who has traveled to a corruption-riddled village in search of access to a sacred mountain shrine, while in pursuit of a masked spirit who is the culprit behind the village's current predicament. As a spirit guide, Kena's job is to help lingering spirits move on by collecting relics that they left behind, granting her visions of their past to see what's keeping them tethered to the human world. The game features 3 total storylines that explore themes of trauma and forgiveness among friends, family, and lovers, and each storyline is full of heart, which is assisted by fantastic voice acting and an S-tier soundtrack. Seriously, the soundtrack is stunning. It can be very whimsical when you're out exploring the world, but will hit you right in the heart during some of the more emotional cutscenes. And this definitely happened to me during each of the 3 storylines. Interestingly, it did feel like, among the characters you get to interact with throughout the game, Kena herself was the one whose backstory was explored the least. They do touch on her desire to live up to the expectations of her late father a little bit, but it didn't feel nearly as fleshed out as the other characters, despite her being the protagonist of the game. If it hasn't been obvious already, Kena Bridge of Spirits also features an incredibly Pixar-esque art style for its characters. This makes characters endearing to look at as it makes them appear quite colorful and almost childlike in appearance. Equally as colorful as the world itself, which is gorgeously crafted with plenty of lush green scenery to boot. You won't see a large amount of variation beyond a more open plain and more forested areas, but they are presented very beautifully. There was an immense amount of satisfaction I felt after clearing the corruption away from an area to see the vibrant colors return and breathe life back into the earth. As you're doing this, you'll occasionally run across the little rot spirits, who not only play an integral role in the gameplay, but the game's story as well. I won't spoil anything, but after playing the game through to its end, I had an even greater desire to go back and spend countless hours collecting every last little one of these little fellas that I could. And that is highly encouraged by the game, as exploring its absolutely delightful world is a huge part of the actual gameplay. As mentioned, exploration plays a large role in terms of gameplay, as you'll be scouring each area looking for rot spirits, spirit mail, treasure chests, meditation spots, and more. These are scattered throughout a fairly open and seamless world, so you'll need to check every nook and cranny you come across as to not miss out on any items. Of course, none of this is actually required to complete the game. You could just blitz through all of the story quests and finish the game in one sitting if you wanted, but there's still plenty of reward in taking your time to explore, as you may find some important upgrades for Kena. You do get some assistance in finding collectibles through the masks you'll be given during the storyline. Kena can put these masks on to highlight objects in the environment and help track down hidden rot spirits. I found this to be a nice addition, so you're not spending hours on end looking for that last collectible you missed. The combat itself might feel familiar to those who have played plenty of Soulslikes. You'll have your usual dodge rolls, blocks, and parries you'll need to utilize in order to survive attacks against enemies and bosses. Overall though, it's not nearly as complicated as other games in the genre, as you really only have a few weapons to utilize. Kena's staff, a bow, and some bombs. This may feel less satisfying for some who may desire a more intricate combat system with multiple different builds, but I think the game does pull off this simplified version of Souls-like combat quite well. Attacks feel like they have plenty of weight to them, and parries feel extremely satisfying to pull off, although I did admittedly experience some minor jank with the lock-on targeting, not always going where I wanted it to go. Beyond that, the combat handled just fine and even felt incredibly smooth when switching from bomb to bow to staff during enemy encounters. Kena does also have access to some handy rod abilities in combat at the cost of a resource called Courage, which is charged up through landing blows on enemies. One of the more useful rot abilities, and my favorite ability to spam, was the Rot Hammer, which dealt massive damage to bosses when used up close. Courage can also be spent to have your rot spirits hold an enemy in place, which was absolutely crucial during some boss battles, giving me a moment to heal or land yet another Rot Hammer. Speaking of boss battles, they're surprisingly challenging. The game does start off quite easy, but I found bosses getting noticeably more difficult towards the end of the first chapter. The fight against the Sprout Captain stood out to me particularly due to his very fast movements and tough to avoid attacks. If you haven't gotten the hang of parrying and using rot abilities, he'll absolutely run circles around you. I found this fight to be pretty thrilling and marked the point in the game for me where I knew the developer can crank out some pretty compelling boss fights. This was then confirmed only a short while later when I encountered the game's first major boss, Corrupt Taro. He's an incredibly agile yet easy to punish boss that I had a blast facing off against. It's one of those fights that felt challenging yet fair, as it didn't feel cheap in any way. Any deaths I suffered were on me, and I was able to analyze where I went wrong so I wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The enemies themselves come in a pretty decent variety. You have your typical small grunt-like enemies, normal soldier enemies, big brute enemies, flying enemies, and so on. They'll typically show up in groups, so it's up to you to determine which enemies take priority on your kill list during an encounter. This adds a nice little bit of decision making to each fight, which can become absolutely crucial when playing on harder difficulties. You can also take on the game's trials, which offer rewards for completing certain challenges. There are trials for fighting waves of enemies and redoing boss battles, which can challenge you with completing the trial without healing or taking any damage at all. There's also platforming and archery trials, which will have you complete the course in a limited amount of time, or require you to hit a certain number of targets. If you're looking to get a perfect score in these trials, be prepared to spend a lot of time retrying them over and over again, because they are actually quite challenging. Especially the take no damage challenges and some of the combat trials, which made me want to chuck my controller out the window. These will truly test your mastery of the game's mechanics, and I think they're a great addition that will continue to keep me busy even after completing the game's main story. There's not too much complexity when it comes to progression in Kena Bridge of Spirits. You'll earn karma throughout the game to unlock abilities for each of Kena's weapons, which are pretty basic, like giving Kena more arrows for her bow or increased shield strength, but there are also unlockable rod abilities that play a much larger role in combat. This obviously includes my favorite ability, Rot Hammer, as well as the ability to fire a powered up arrow that pierces through multiple enemies. And I had no problem unlocking the majority of these by the end of the game without needing to farm for karma too much. You'll also collect gems during your travels, which are used to purchase outfits for Kena and hats for collected rot spirits. These have no impact on the gameplay and are entirely for the purpose of aesthetics. I did like that you could outfit each individual rot spirit with a different hat, allowing for a greater level of customization among your little group of friends, but I'll admit I was a little disappointed after completing a particularly tough challenge or puzzle, only to find that my reward was a goofy hat. One of the more impactful rewards you'll find throughout the game are Charm Stones, which essentially grant Kena a single perk like refilling her shield after a parry or increased bomb damage. You can only equip one at a time, so you need to choose wisely which one you want to take into combat. There are 15 total that you can find, and during my initial playthrough, I only managed to find 5 of them, as it appears many are locked behind completing the game's trials. So there's an even greater reward for challenging yourself through perfecting each trial, as the Charm Stones do seem to have a considerable impact on how you approach combat. Of course, you can also find some through simply exploring the world as well. Exploration also ties into how you upgrade Kena's abilities and maximum health. While finding and collecting rot spirits might just seem like simple fun from a collector's standpoint, you'll need to find a certain amount of rot spirits to rank up and have access to higher tier abilities. I like that this nudges more combat-focused players to explore the world a little more, as it's really one of the major draws of the game. This also applies to the meditation spots, which are scattered throughout each area. Finding these spots and meditating at them will increase Kena's maximum health, which is essential, as any Souls-like player knows there's a massive difference between dying in 3 hits instead of dying in 2 hits. Once again, another subtle nod by the developers that it's in your best interest to go out and explore the world if you want to maximize Kena's potential and not make you suffer later in the game. Not to mention, when you meditate at one of these locations, you'll get some pretty stunning shots of the surrounding area. After all, if you've got a game with gorgeous visuals, why not show it off? To wrap things up, let's recap what Kena Bridge of Spirits did well and where it may have fallen short. For the positives, the world is beautifully presented with stunning scenery and expressive, colorful characters. Because of this, exploring the world is incredibly satisfying, especially when clearing the corruption away and watching life return to the area. The game features a top-tier soundtrack that is emotional enough to make even the toughest of gamers shed a tear. The game's bosses and enemies offer a nice difficulty curve that eases you in at first and then punishes you later. Combat, simple as it is, feels great with weighty attacks and fluid movements. And trials offer a considerable challenge for those seeking it and can feel extremely rewarding to overcome. For the negatives, Kena's backstory could have been explored a little more, and this lack of character development made her somewhat overshadowed by the side characters. There were too many aesthetic rewards with no real impact on gameplay. Seriously, there's way too many hats. And overall character progression is very simple, leaving little room for ways to customize how you play aside from Charm Stones. Overall, I can't recommend Kena Bridge of Spirits enough if you still haven't tried it yet in 2023. Its gameplay is enough to satisfy even the most experienced of Souls-like veterans, and offers enough puzzles and exploration to satisfy those who'd like to take a completionist approach to games. As for myself, it's got me incredibly excited for what developer Ember Lab is cooking up next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and let me know what you think in the comments below. I appreciate every bit of interaction and support, as I love making videos like this. So please subscribe if you want to see more, and thank you for watching.